I stand before you for two reasons. I'd like to welcome you to our annual GTU lecture. GTU is the Geography Honor Society, and so we have this. We sponsor this annual lecture, and we have new students being inducted tonight. So this is a great time of year for the department. And the second reason I'm here is to introduce not our speaker, but our introducer. Kristen Weymouth is the GTU president, and she's going to introduce our speaker today. Thank you, Kristen.
It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Bryan Godfrey. Dr. Godfrey is a professor of geography for the Earth Science and Geography Department at Vassar College, where he teaches courses surrounding urban and regional change. After having attained a bachelor's degree in history at Pomona College in Claremont, California, and an MA and PhD in geography with a focus in city and regional planning at the University of California, Berkeley, his research provides a historical lens into how and why social, spatial, and environmental patterns change over time. Additionally, he studies how placemaking and public space interact with race, memory, and political ecology. In particular, his expertise in the geographic area of Brazilian urban cities, and more specifically Rio de Janeiro, have brought about important field research on the place and space of race and class in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, as well as in the Amazonian rainforest cities. He has published multiple books on urban development in the U.S., Brazil, and the Amazon, as well as publishing many articles over the years. We are very fortunate to have him here with us today. Please welcome Dr. Bryan Godfrey.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, is it pretty clear?
Can I make a public service announcement first?
Yes, of
Sorry,
course.
thank you, Kristen. There was a mistake with the reception we were expecting to have at 4:15 or 4 o'clock, 4:15 before the talk began. It was set up in the wrong place. It's all been moved back, so there's lots of food outside. So at the end of the talk, please, we can all congregate around the delicious food catered by Curtain Call, and perhaps have some more questions and conversation. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Bryan.
Great, yeah, thanks, Maureen. Well, it's a pleasure to be here at Colgate. I've heard what a great school it is for years and years, and I've had many good colleagues from Colgate, like Maureen, actually. So it's great to be here. And Vassar is very similar. It's kind of small liberal arts college, selective, very rigorous, and so forth. We're Division 3, however. You're Division 1 at Colgate. Now, how do you do that? A small school? Anyway, it's a very, very impressive campus, very beautiful. So actually, speaking of athletics, that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about the impact of the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. So I'm actually not going to talk that much about the athletic events themselves, but more about the role that sports played in the games, the 2016 games. And so they touch on a lot of aspects of life in terms of urban renewal, the environment, social relations, issues of community, and probably the biggest one is the investment that the country and the city made in these games in the midst of a really deep economic recession and a political crisis that's been going on in Brazil. So this will be our topic today. And this is actually a view of the new Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro. It's one of the redevelopment projects that they put in place in preparation for the 2014 World Cup and also the 2016 Games. I wonder if we can. Is that good? So anyhow, here you see, and this is the city, the Olympic city, Cidade Olímpica in Portuguese.
Sorry, I'm gonna adjust the lights here, not in the dark here. Sorry about that.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of light would be good.
How's that? Is that the right
pretty
setting?
good?
That was the good setting, yeah?
Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is mega events. And this is now a huge literature, is what are these huge international spectacles? In recent years, they've tended to be athletic. So we think of the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup, soccer, right? We think of the Summer and the Winter Olympic Games, which are now huge spectacles. Probably the Olympics is the biggest of these mega events, but there are a number of others. Now, these aren't entirely new because we used to have world fairs, right? Starting in the late 19th century, we would have world expositions, world fairs, which are also huge. But something about the Olympics is particularly appealing, but these are really huge events. For example, in Rio de Janeiro in 2016, it attracted over 12,000 athletes, over 25,000 journalists, hundreds of thousands of visitors and tourists. So you can see just the idea of hosting this size an event is a real challenge for any society. So the issue that a lot of people are raising now for these mega events is, are they worth it? What's the payoff for this? Because actually on paper, they don't usually make money anymore. It's been, I think, 2 or 3 decades. I think the last one, I think Atlanta might have made money. But for many years they haven't made money, although a lot of people make money associated with the Olympics, right? The promoters, the contractors, and all these other people do make a lot of money. But on paper, in terms of the investment, they aren't necessarily profitable. And so there's a debate now about mega events, and are they worth it? For example, there's a discussion now about, should we have a new format for the Olympics? Perhaps one that repeats the same site twice, and maybe could skip the following time to come back, because there's such a massive investment in the infrastructure to just use it once. People wonder, is that a good investment, right? Or maybe we should just have one place in the world to continually offer the Olympics. Maybe it should be in Greece, since that's where the Olympics originally came from. So all these ideas are swirling around. But I do think there's something about the international competition and changing site that for many people is very attractive, because you get to know a new part of the world, sort of thing every time the games change. So a lot of issues come up also about who benefits from these games. In urban geography, urban studies, we talk about the growth machine. And the growth machine is an alliance of developers, banks, labor interests, pro-development groups that like to see development projects, urban renewal, go forward as a way to make money, right? So it's a way to kind of keep the city growing. It's what David Harvey, the geographer, talks about as the spatial fix. And this is when capitalism runs into problems of low profitability, of recession, and so forth. It often is very a lot of people like to mount a new kind of economic regime, perhaps to change the spatial organization or to move production to a new site. But the Olympics is a form of this as well, the spatial fix, because you're redeveloping a site, massive amounts of money going into creating new infrastructures, building new athletic venues, but also housing, all these things for a site. So it's an immediate injection of money, right, into a place. But then there's the downside. A lot of people talk about Olympics in Rio this last time. People talk about the calamity games, that it was terrible for Rio because it displaced a lot of people. Tens of thousands of people were displaced because of the construction. So a whole movement started against the Olympics. At this point in Brazil, now they're debating the legacy. And they always do about the Olympics. Really, what's the legacy? Was this investment worthwhile? What are the benefits of this growth through new infrastructures and so forth? And the example often goes back to Barcelona in 1992. The Barcelona Olympics in 1992 were thought to be very successful at raising Barcelona's profile. They also put in place a number of urban renewal projects that really benefited the city. They redeveloped the waterfront. They put in new housing. They redid public squares in the city. They put in a new promenade, boulevards, and so forth that proved very appealing for the population as well as visitors. And so Barcelona is a city that is thought to have leveraged the Olympics very well in raising its visibility. There's generally, I think, maybe favorable reviews of the London Olympics in 2012. So you can look at each sort of Olympics in terms of the pros and cons. Despite all the criticism, actually, of Olympics in terms of priorities, cities are already lining up for future Olympics in 2024. I think Los Angeles is going to be up for it again, but that would be the third Olympics, actually, in LA. So the issue comes up, how do you evaluate the legacy for the Olympics? And also the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. So that's my topic today. But first of all, should give you some political context. So Brazil's in the midst of a political crisis right now. The president, the first female president of Brazil, sorry about that, Dilma Rousseff. I keep going forward, and I need to go back. Okay, here's Dilma. The first woman president of Brazil was just impeached earlier this year. And she was of the Workers' Party. The President Lula here, Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva, just known as Lula really, was also of the Workers' Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores in Portuguese. The new president that took over, who was vice president, now is president, is Michel Temer. They're of the Worker Party, which is kind of on the left, right? Kind of moderate left, really. But they've put in place really important redistributive policies. They have poverty assistance for poor families around the country and so forth. So it's actually been very successful at changing distribution. So the fact that they were impeached has led to a lot of theories about, does this mean that Brazil's changing course? The complicating factor, too, though, is that Brazil's been in an economic recession since about 2013, 2014. And so this year, I think the economy is supposed to contract by about 3% or so. Last year, it contracted about 3%. That's actually been a complicating factor. So this has been in the midst of all this turmoil. The Olympics took place.
No, I think someone is up.
Okay, I'll just remember that one. I
Yeah,
can
that one.
hit it. So this is taking place in the midst, but the Olympics were actually bid upon and received by Lula in better economic times. So just let me show you one here. So this is 2015. This is actually 1965. But if you look at the 1990s, they were pretty. This is 0% right here, right? You can see this is per capita growth of GDP. So in the 1990s, Brazil did pretty well. There was a recession around 2000. Then they were doing really great until, let's see, 2007, 2008. But they actually weathered our Great Recession pretty well. And then the economy started to grow again. But since about 2013, they've been taking a nosedive. And partly it's largely commodity prices have gone down. So a lot of the things Brazil sells, like soybeans, timber, iron ore, and so forth, the commodity prices have gone way, way down. So that's really hurt them. And a lot of their trade is with China, and China's also been suffering in recent years. So Brazil hasn't been selling as much, and so their exports have declined dramatically. They also had a big corruption scandal at the highest levels of government with the country's oil company, Petrobras. About $8 or $9 billion were stolen out of it for political purposes, largely by the Workers' Party, actually. So that was one of the factors that led to Dilma's impeachment. So with that, we can proceed and look a little bit more at the Olympics. So in 2009, this is what Lula said about the Olympics. He was the president at the time, and he said, "Today, I have felt prouder of being Brazilian than on any other day. Today is the day that Brazil gained its international citizenship. Today is the day that we have overcome the last vestiges of prejudice against us. I think this is the day to celebrate because Brazil has left behind the level of second-class countries and entered the ranks of first-class countries. Today we earned respect. The world has finally recognized that this is Brazil's time." So this was in 2009. Subsequently, they went through a lot of economic turmoil and political crisis. But at the time, there was great celebration, right, about Brazil getting the Olympics for a designation for 2016. And meanwhile, in Rio de Janeiro, which is the second largest city in Brazil, it used to be the capital until 1960, when it moved to Brasilia, and then Sao Paulo became the largest city and the biggest economic engine of the country. So Rio was sort of left trying to find a new way to promote its economy. And they landed upon mega events as a big way to do this because it's a very scenic city. They have great beaches, people are really friendly, a vibrant culture, and so forth. So they have sponsored a lot of international events. The 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. 2007, they had the Pan American Games in Rio. Let's see if I can turn that on. Okay.
You're your own IT guy. That's good.
And then they decided to go for the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics. So part of what Rio needed to do was rebrand itself. They needed to kind of change their image because it was beginning to be seen as a dangerous city with a lot of crime. So they really tried to improve security and kind of rebrand the city as a really fun place to go. And so they, for about a decade, really, almost a decade, the city was on a major campaign to spruce up its image, build new venues for the athletic events, put in better security in the city, and a number of other things related to becoming more of a global city. So here you can see the global city aspirations you began to see in the international press. Like Brazil takes off. Rio is a center of business, infrastructure, logistics, and effective public administration for the business world. These are Rio de Janeiro's new postcards. So you can see the rebranding effort to change the image. And so the Olympics and the World Cup were to be the embodiment of these changes and the way in which Rio would project itself internationally. So it started really with the World Cup, and they were timed together. Actually, one of the reasons Brazil got the 2016 Olympic designation was the fact that they'd also gotten the World Cup designation. So the two were thought to go together. The World Cup actually was played in a number of Brazilian cities, not just Rio. Rio was, I believe, the place where it ended. The final ceremony was in Rio, but it actually occurred at 12 sites of competition in the whole country. And FIFA, the International Soccer Organization, had asked for 8. Brazil decided to build 12, in part because this helped satisfy the growth machine in all these regional cities that wanted federal money, they wanted to build stadiums, they wanted to have infrastructure improvements, and so forth. But it probably, in the view of many experts, especially as Brazil's economy started going south, started to go into recession, was too ambitious. They probably should have concentrated on fewer cities. Some of them are pretty distant. For example, Manaus, up in the Amazon here, is very distant. I remember the Americans played there. It was very hot and sweaty. The other thing is a number of these cities don't really have the high-level professional teams. So here you can see very expensive stadiums in Brasilia, Cuiabá and Mato Grosso, Natal in the northeast, and here's in Manaus in the Amazon. None of these cities have high-level professional soccer teams. So it's a question of whether they'll actually be able to support this investment. Maybe they'll have a rock and roll concert there a couple times a year, but will they? And maybe a few events, but it really won't be used a lot of the time. You can see some of these cities are pretty remote. So let's see, here's Cuiabá, Manaus, Natal, and Brasilia. So there was a big question about whether these are going to be white elephants, stadiums without publics. So you have these gleaming stadiums, and yet maybe they're only going to be used once or twice a year. So that was a big question that people had. Also, you began to have, in 2013, massive protests in Brazil about governmental priorities. Again, the economy was going bad. There was news about this political corruption scandal going on, and people were very worried. They started to have fare hikes of buses. Started in Sao Paulo and so forth, and then it just spread like wildfire across the country. Massive protests in the center of Brazilian cities in the context of slowing growth and rising inflation, and protests continued. And here you can see, for example, this is in downtown Rio de Janeiro. They say the program of attack on the corrupt ones, the corrupt politicians, right? And here was a huge protest right in the. This is right downtown Rio de Janeiro, in the biggest boulevard downtown, of over 100,000 people against corruption and for political change in the country. This is a year before the World Cup. So it's starting to change the discourse. And although Brazilians love sports, and I love soccer, for example, they just wondered about the priorities. Why is the government spending so much money on this when we have other kinds of problems? we don't need the World Cup. We need money for hospitals and educations, which are sorely underfunded in the country. So they started to change the discourse, and this spread like wildfire. A lot of young people who really rely on social media, for example, and they don't even really look at a lot of the major news channels. They have their own communication, social media, and it was just, the Brazilians were stunned, like, where did this come from, right? And it really took over the country. And so it led to a lot of talk about prioritizing a year before the World Cup. And so there were a number of conditions that led to this. First of all, Brazil is an extremely unequal society with very, very rich elites, a growing middle class to be sure, but a lot of people who are still poor. So with all this money going on in mega events, they have very poor quality public services. Public transit is overburdened and kind of expensive. Public health is very deficient. And education is very deficient. So a lot of people are saying, well, why aren't we putting our money here, you know? And also, though, people have, it's a very free press, consolidated democracy, and widespread information access, largely urban population, a lot of young people. And then the spotlight for these mega events became a site of contention. And so activists decided that they wanted to use this leverage of these public events in order to protest and make changes in public policy, because they knew the world's eyes were on Brazil, and this would be a chance to put leaders in the spotlight, right, and have the glare of public publicity from the whole world at this point. And also the leaders needed to put in place these facilities and things or for the upcoming international events. So all this is the context of all of this. And here you can see, I think, the prevailing mood. This is from an artist in Sao Paulo, Paulo Ito, hosted this mural to dramatize misplaced priorities in 2014. And here you can see, I call it "Let Them Eat Football." So it's this child is obviously hungry, is sitting there, and they put a soccer ball in front of him. So this was, I think, what a lot of Brazilians were upset about. Even though, as I say, Brazilians are totally nuts over football. So that's not the issue. It's about the priorities, I think, of the events. So this is kind of the background, I think, for the Olympics. And the Olympics in 2016 occurred just in Rio de Janeiro. So Rio was hit twice, actually, in terms of all the planning and preparation for these mega events. In some ways it was beneficial, in some ways it was not, as we're going to see. But first of all, so the city has a geography of division. First of all, this map is focused on the southern zone of the city, which is the most luxurious, the most beautiful zone of the city. And so here you have Flamengo, Copacabana, Ipanema, Leblon, and so this is kind of, and look, it's very exaggerated in this picture too. It's actually not this big a part of the city. Most people live in the northern part or the western part of the city. So it's a very divided city between the wealthy south and the rest of the city, the north and the west particularly. So I thought what we could do is evaluate Rio's Olympic legacy. And we'll look at 5 different factors. One is Olympic construction and finances. These will be very brief. We'll go over them quickly. Olympic transportation projects, Olympic ecology and environmentalism, Olympic inclusion and social justice, and Olympic imaginary and memory and public response. Okay? So I thought what we would do is we will grade them, and we'll grade this is very professorial, isn't it? Of course, students who understand about grading, so we'll grade them here. So we'll look first at Olympic construction and finances. So the Olympics, of course, have something like 40 different sports now, and so they demand a lot of investment in venues. They actually had 4 different nuclei of events in Rio. Number 1 here is in actually a very poor part of the city. They have a lot of favelas. Favelas are self-constructed neighborhoods, informal communities, and favelas, sometimes called slums, they are very denigrated in Brazil. They have a very bad reputation, and indeed they have a lot of have had historically a lot of narco traffic, a lot of drug trafficking, and battles with the police. But they have long-term communities that have struggled to stay there for decades and decades. If any of you have seen the movie A City of God, that depicts a favela. So Diodoro here actually has a lot of favelas up here, and you can see they have a lot of facilities they built, an aquatic center, a shooting center. They have the equestrian site up here. They have the cycling, the canoe and kayaking. So they have this one up here. Number 2 is they call it the Rio Centro. This is where they had the main press corps, the Olympic Village. This is in the western part of the city. It's a growing area. Has a very affluent population along the coast, but actually inland it's pretty poor. And here they have a lot of different events. Perhaps the most controversial was this one, the golf course. So they put in a massive golf course, and actually Rio had a big drought during this period, so they were watering the golf course while a lot of the city was being rationed for water. So that was, now I think they're back to normal with water, but anyway, that was rather controversial. I think the Olympics actually had stopped using, I think they had done golf back in Paris, like in 1898 or something, but they stopped doing golf. Now they're doing golf again. They usually add events every Olympics. So this one is probably the biggest center, and it's in the western part of the city where it doesn't have as many people, so it was easier to build. And then the third area was where they have the football stadium, Maracanã, which they totally renovated. So you have the soccer stadium, they have volleyball, marathon, archery. They also, let's see. Oh, and then the fourth area here, they call this Copacabana. They also have the sailing here, and they have the beach volleyball, marathon swimming, the triathlon, cycling, canoeing, rowing, and a lot of these are happening in the water here. And partly they're happening in Guanabara Bay, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but has been very polluted. That was a big source of controversy, was the pollution of the bay. And so you can see it's a very extensive kind of repertoire, right, of a series of sites and so forth. Here's the Olympic Park, for example, and it has a lagoon right out in front. And here you can see the beachfront apartments. This was a massive development, and here you have the Olympic Village where the athletes stayed. And this would be turned into private exclusive housing. And this part had the press center and a lot of athletic events, stadium, and so forth. So in terms of budgeting, actually Rio came out pretty well in this all. So this is from the mayor's office of Rio, so it's in Portuguese, but this says legacy here. This is Portuguese for legacy, and these are in Brazilian currency, but if you just divide that in half, it'll be about the value of $1. So they said of about 40 billion reais in Brazil, or $20 billion they spent on the games. About 70% of this they called legacy, meaning these are investments that will help the city in the long run. And what are some of these legacy investments? The two biggest ones are mobility, transportation, which is about $6 or $7 billion of investment, and then urban renewal, about $9 billion. I'm sorry, this would be about $4 or $5 billion. And then a few others like social, here's environmental, you can see how small the environment is, sports infrastructure, science, technology. Let's see, the other thing was that the private investors gave about 40% of the money. Now these would be private corporations that want to use it for branding or for advertisement, so they'll name the center after themselves, right? So that did raise a lot of money. And then the rest was split between the federal, state, local governments. But actually, Rio actually did pretty well. In the midst of a recession, it got all this infusion of money, right? So actually, I think it helped the city in some ways. Here's the Olympic Park. And one of the conflicts in the Olympic Park was that there already was a community there. This is the community. It actually was reduced to about the size, but it had actually been settled on this whole area. And it was an informal community. It was a favela. It was called Vila, or it is called really Vila Autódromo, and it actually was settled legally. They didn't have land titles, but it wasn't. Nobody was trying to evict them until this event happened, and then they were evicted, right? So led to this whole debate about a community with thousands of people that had to move in order for them to make facilities for the events. And now the local community, working with activists, developed a popular plan for them to stay there and coexist with the games and be incorporated into the games, but the city didn't really like that. They wanted to have a more, I guess you'd say, cohesive or homogeneous kind of community. So that plan was not, despite many protests, was overturned, and the community was largely moved out, although there's something only like a few families were able to stay there. And so this is the community here. So only this little remnant here. So this is typical of what's happening in a large part of the city. Many people are being displaced. But in terms of, again, we're talking about the built environment investment right now, right? So you can see one of the things that I liked about the games was they started using more flexible architecture that could be used for various purposes, sometimes dismantled and rebuilt other places. They're sometimes calling this nomadic architecture that will allow you to adapt it to other purposes later, like a community center or a swimming center, or like the aquatic stadiums to be reassembled as two community pools. Or one of the arenas going to be being dismantled into two local schools. So this is actually really good, I think, this kind of trend. And I think more and more architects are thinking about how to use this architecture for these mega events later for more social purposes, which would be really great. They're also talking about turning the Olympic Park into a public park, but most of the housing will be private upscale housing. So if you look at this one right here, this is all, this housing for the Olympic Village will all be upscale luxury housing. But again, that was the way the developer had the incentive to build it also, right? So the private developer made the investment in the housing with the promise that it could later be turned into luxury housing. So that's the economics of the neoliberal model, which is going to depend on that for the private, to guarantee private capital a profit afterwards. So anyway, then transportation. Let's look at transportation now. Let's see. I think I was going to grade them for this first part, wasn't I? I'm sorry. So I gave them, let's see. So the Olympic construction and finances, so Brazil certainly was successful in holding the venue. They finished all the projects in time, barely at some point. Projects were paid largely for the federal government and private investors, so that's good. There's this encouraging trend toward flexible architecture. But I do think that some of the projects like Vila Autódromo and others could have been more socially sensitive and incorporated local populations more. And I think that they could have done their planning farther in advance, which would have been beneficial. So I gave them a B+. I thought they did it. They did pretty well, especially because they were given all this. It was sort of a deadline. They had to be done, and they managed to pull off the event. So I gave them a B+ for that. Now let's turn to Olympic transportation projects. So the transportation, they had a large number. Most of the expenditures were on transportation or urban renewal. So one of the things they did was to extend the subway. So here they extended the subway out to the Olympic Village here, or nearly. A bus took them from this site to the Olympic Village. They added some BRT, bus rapid transit lines, and I think that was beneficial. They added 4 to the areas, one from the western part, one from the Olympic Village to downtown, one to the northern part of the city, and another actually going more downtown and through the southern sector, the southern sector of the city. So these were all beneficial, and they also put in a light rail. This light rail connects between the bus lines and the subway lines, the metro lines. It connects the regional airport with the bus station. I actually think, first of all, I love light rail, so I have to give away that prejudice. And so I think this was probably a good investment. This one cost probably about $1 billion, these lines downtown, and a lot of these neighborhoods were pretty poor. So kind of integrated the neighborhoods into this network, because that was another part of it. And it also was partly urban renewal. So they had a huge urban renewal project on the port. They called it the Marvelous Port, because they called Rio the Marvelous City, so the Porto Maravilha. And so they had this urban renewal campaign. They put in infrastructure. This is related also to the environmental issues. So they were trying to clean up the water in the bay, put in some 11 miles of bike paths. They demolished an elevated highway downtown and put in this broad boulevard that you see here. And it benefited a lot of the neighborhoods. It was based on the principles of walkability, sustainability, creative urbanism. There was some concern about gentrification or possibly displacing existing residents from this port community, and that is a concern. I don't know how much displacement's happened yet, but they're certainly trying to make it more of a creative district with young professionals and so forth. So that was an issue. But I think overall, let me see. I thought actually the transportation was maybe one of the best. I gave this an A-, the transportation, because I said the main fault might be that the improvements were not done in time, which caused large traffic jams. It could have been done, I think, with more consideration for some of the local communities that would be benefited. But actually, I think transportation was one of the strong points. Now, many critics will say, well, the transportation improvements only benefited the affluent populations. I don't think that's actually entirely true, because you can see a lot of them were benefiting the bus rapid transit from poorer communities. Actually, I think transportation may be a really important legacy, transportation improvements for the future. So there's a debate about that in Brazil, what the social consequences are. But I do think that even though it may have benefited the rich communities a little bit more, I think actually it's benefiting the whole city as well. Then we go to ecology. So I know some of you may have studied, this is Guanabara Bay, one of the world's great natural resources. It's a great harbor, but it's become incredibly polluted in recent years. So this has become a huge issue. This is the bridge across the bay going from Rio to a neighbor city called Niterói. And it's still a lot of islands and so forth in the bay. This is downtown Rio. And the concern here was also that they had a lot of Olympic events, the rowing, the windsurfing, the sailing, and so forth were going to occur in the bay. And the build-up to the Olympics pointed out a lot of the problems. This has actually been a problem for many, many years. In the 1990s, they started a massive depollution of Guanabara Bay after the 1992 World Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit. And it spent about $1 billion with massive amounts from the Inter-American Development Bank and also the Development Bank of Japan. But they were supposed to be, it was supposed to be depolluted by 2000, and it certainly wasn't. It still remained very, very polluted. Until about 1960, you could probably swim in the bay. But since the 1960s, they now have a major petrol refinery plant there, petroleum refinery. It's the main port for Brazilian offshore petroleum exploration. And so they've had large oil spills in 1975, 2000. There's a lot of industry in the northern part of the city. It's the industrial zone, but there also are a lot of informal settlements, favelas, that don't have sewage treatment, so they're just dumping raw sewage into the bay. And so this has been a huge, huge issue over the years. In terms of ecological problems, you can see it's a wonderfully large bay, but it has a very narrow entrance. So the flushing effect of the ocean is much reduced. So you don't have a lot of fresh ocean currents able to enter the bay. And it's also fairly shallow in the northern parts, which is leading to kind of a eutrophication, sort of a reduction in the size of the bay as well. So this has been a huge problem that they took on during the bay. Let's see. So as I said, they planned on reducing pollution by 90% by 1999, but the program fell far short of expectations. And at this point, they've actually made a lot of progress. About 51% of the wastewater going into the bay is now treated. That's only 51%, right? So it's only about half. about half the wastewater going to the bay is still not, it's just raw sewage, right? So it's still a huge issue. Now, I actually didn't hear anybody getting sick from the rowing or sailing cruise. Not that I know of. Actually, I do remember one woman who said she was practicing on it, she did say she was ill. But hopefully, I don't know, it didn't turn out to be too much of a hindrance to the teams. I didn't hear a lot about it in Rio. Oh, the other thing I was just talking to Maureen beforehand was Zika. You heard a lot about Zika, the Zika virus before. It was winter in Rio. I didn't hear anything more about Zika, and I was there in July. So I guess Zika sometimes you won't know until later. But I don't think that turned out to be as big a problem as people thought it would be. It was winter, so the mosquitoes were not as abundant. That was another environmental thing. Okay, so the next, so on environment, let's see, I think I gave them a C+. I gave them a C+ on the environment because they should have done a lot better on the bay. The bay, they had a lot of, going back to the 1990s, that was a lot of time they had to clean up the bay. I know it is expensive and complicated with informal communities that need to be hooked up, but still, I think they could have done better. So I gave them a C+ on the environment. Next we'll go to Olympic inclusion and social justice. So here you have some boys from the favelas, and they're flying kites. The boys love to do this. It's kind of a common sight. Favelas are the self-constructed. They're very prevalent in Rio. About a quarter of the population of the city lives in informal settlements. And this is because it's a major site of in-migration. They have a housing shortage. And so historically, for about a century at least, migrants that move to the city don't have, the housing's not available or it's too expensive, and so they tend to squat on lands on the periphery around the city, sometimes on hills and so forth. This has been a very stigmatized population. It tends to be poor, often people of color. They're not officially or totally segregated by race, but certainly there's a lot of intersectionality of race and class in the favelas for sure. So how have they been affected? A lot of the communities that were displaced were favelados. They were communities of favelas. One of the first ones that became apparent was during the World Cup. They were evicting people at a community called the Favela do Metro, which was the favela of the subway. It was near one of the subway stations near Maracanã Stadium, and they wanted to turn it into a parking lot for the World Cup. And so this was a very big controversy. And estimates vary, but human rights groups say that at least 20,000 residents had to move because of displacement for the games, both the World Cup and the Olympics. So this has been a big issue in the city, which in the context of all the other protests made the games much more controversial in the country. And then you have favelas like Santa Marta here, which is a very famous one. Here's Michael Jackson made a video there. After he died, they put up a mural and a statue in his honor. This was a community, though, that had long been dominated by narco-traffickers. And actually, Jackson and Spike Lee, who made his video, actually negotiated directly with the drug traffickers about permission to actually work in that community. But it also became the first community for the federal government, or the state government, really, with federal support, to put in, they called them UPPs, the units of pacifying police. They come in with the army and they evict the drug traffickers and then put in a permanent police station and try to put in some social services as well. And there are probably about 40 communities have been, and they use the word pacified, in that they've reclaimed the communities from control by drug traffickers. And this seemed to be fairly successful initially, but in recent years it sort of slowed down, and there have been a number of problems between the UPPs, pacifying police units, and the local communities. Sometimes the local people have been caught in gun battles between drug traffickers and the police. And sometimes the police have just been not very sensitive. So, as in this country, there are a lot of issues of police-community relationships in poorer communities. It's the same in Brazil. And so that's been a real issue in Brazil as well. There's also a concern that in some of the communities that have been pacified, that they're now gentrifying. And about half a dozen communities, they're very well situated, great views, a southern zone and so forth, that they might be gentrified or upgraded to higher status. and displace a lot of the local residents. One of the things, though, I think that did happen is during the Olympics, the discourse on the favelas changed a lot. They had a lot of NGOs like Rio on Watch and other advocacy groups that helped, they catered to journalists and tried to improve the reporting. And so you saw a lot better reporting, and I think one of the positive results of the Olympics is you saw the development of social movements in Brazil to really have debates about these issues. So this is, I think, a positive element. So actually, in terms of Olympic ecology, I gave a C+. In terms of Olympic inclusion and social justice, I gave a C-. I thought they didn't do very well on that. They could have done much better, I think, in supporting the local population. So lastly, we'll go to Olympic imaginary images and public response. So first of all, before the Olympics, you got to remember the press coverage was really bad. You had insecurity, environmental issues, the Zika virus, socioeconomic and political problems, all these things. And these are just some of the headlines of papers. I tend to read the New York Times, the Guardian, the Atlantic, and these kind of newspapers. Here's one. Brazil's Olympic catastrophe. Can Rio pull off the games with only weeks to go? Rio 2016 billed up part of the chaotic and corrupt tradition of Olympic hosts. Days before the Olympics, Rio families say goodbye to their homes. The broken promise of the Rio Olympics. Rio may be the glummest city ever to host Summer Olympics. What's in the water? Pollution fears taint Rio's picturesque bay ahead of the Olympics. The Rio 2016 Games are unhealthy and un-Olympian. As the Olympics near, Brazil and Rio let the bad times roll. So there was a lot of bad press beforehand. So this is kind of the background for the Olympics. And yet, I think, and certainly most Brazilians before the Games were against the priorities. They thought it was misplaced priorities, too much budget. But I think that during the Olympics, it won over most of the Brazilians. First of all, the open ceremony, even though the budget was really cut back, it really played to Brazil, it celebrated Brazilian history, culture, music. And look at the image in the background. This is a favela. You see what I mean? So they did make, at least in the opening ceremonies, really make an event about Brazilian culture and a chance for the world to get to know Brazil. And I think that really resonated with Brazilians. And it included a lot of famous artists, musicians, actors, and so forth. And so this, I think, started to win people over greatly toward the Brazil. And the other thing that happened, a couple other things. One was in the midst of this urban renewal campaign, along the northern port here to clean up Guanabara Bay and improve the waterfront, they rediscovered an old slave wharf in Rio where almost 2 million slaves had been imported to Brazil. And although slavery was abolished in 1888, it started this whole conversation about racism and the remnants of slavery in the country that I think has been actually very helpful in Brazil. Especially because a lot of the cultural impacts, they actually had a community called Little Africa, where until the early 20th century, African languages were spoken. And this is the hearth of a lot of Brazilians' popular culture of samba, music, and dance. So inadvertently, really, during the urban renewal, it was a chance to commemorate, to memorialize, in a way, this landscape that had been buried. And so there was a lot of debate about that. And a lot of activists feel the government's not giving due attention to this. But it started the conversation, which I think is good. And here's actually the wharf that was uncovered. It actually stopped work on the urban renewal site for a while after this was going on. But I think it started a debate. So that was very positive, I think, in a way, to kind of think about the past. And then the first Brazilian athlete to win a medal in this Olympic was Rafaela Silva. She was a judoka. She practiced judo, and she won the first gold medal of the Olympics, the Brazilian gold medal. She grew up in City of God, the notorious favela, right? Here, where she's visiting with, I think it's her sister, and she played soccer before she discovered judo, because the girls at that point didn't play soccer, so she played with the boys. Now they do, by the way. There are a lot of women play soccer in Brazil, too. But so to a lot of Brazilians, her triumph over poverty and racism to win an Olympic gold, it just really resonated. Everybody thought, oh, isn't that great? So it started to win people over, even though they'd been really critical of all this expenditure for the Olympics. So actually that just started to win people over. So anyway, after I was in Brazil during July, and afterwards I called a friend of mine that I always see when I go down to visit, Jurandir, and I said, Jurandir, he's lived there for all his life. I said, what did you think about the Olympics? Were you satisfied with them? And so what he told me afterwards, he says, I liked it. The opening was really beautiful and really creative, and the closing was like the end of a party, full of joy and music. Ryan Lochte had the punishment he deserved. Do you remember who Ryan Lochte was? He was the swimmer who got really drunk and I don't know, they ended up at a gas station and he said that the police had robbed him or something like that. But then they found the footage of the surveillance camera that showed none of that had really occurred. So it was actually an international scandal. It made a lot of news here, but in Brazil, they were livid over it. They just were so upset about that. So you could see, this is the controversy. Ryan Lochte got his punishment. So anyway, he was happy with that. And he said, I hope he learned his lesson. We did have problems, but the catastrophe that some expected did not happen. People organized and debated the Olympics. Brazil showed that with joy, we know how to carry on in life. So with that, how did Brazil score, at least in my evaluation? So we can look at Olympic construction and finances, maybe a B+. Olympic transportation, I would give them an A-. I know some people would disagree with me on that, but I think transportation, public transit is really important for cities, so I think that I would give them an A- on that one. Ecology and environmentalism, I gave them C+. I know that there's still a lot of raw sewage is going to Guanabara Bay, but they have improved it, right? So they're starting to make a bit of an improvement. So this is all a little subjective, I realize. But Olympic inclusion, social justice, C-. Olympic imaginary collective memory, maybe a B+. So what is the total grade? I give them a B. You think that's fair? I mean, they pulled it off, you know. I mean, it was a huge investment. Everybody was afraid, you know, that it was going to be a disaster. That's the thing about the Olympics. You know, now it's such a challenge to host this event. It's the biggest event in the world, right? And how do you do it in a developing country with all these strains, especially in the midst of a recession and a global crisis? Let's see. Do I have anything else to say there? Okay, in conclusion, there were many benefits to hosting these events, especially given the federal subsidy to Rio. The improvements to transportation, waterfronts, and facilities were notable, although the residents that were, the displacement of residents were unfortunate. And of course, one of the things is athletic mega events can't solve all social problems. So part of me, even though I'm a progressive, I am idealistic, I have to be pragmatic too. And so they are working within a certain context here. So while advanced planning could have been better, the Brazilian adaptability and ingenuity did prevail at the end. So overall, I think Brazil did an okay job, and I'm glad that it succeeded, but it does raise a lot of questions for the future about how to host these events in ways that are equitable, sustainable, and really leave a lasting legacy for the population. So with that, I thank you, and if anybody have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So, any questions? It always takes one person to ask a question. And so, yes.
When people were relocated, was there one area in specific that they were relocated to?
Yeah, so the question was when people are relocated, where were they relocated to? That's a great question. Usually, though, it was farther west, kind of to the outskirts of the city. And so a lot of people who relocated didn't really like that because then it's farther to go. You know what I mean? Then to get to work and so forth, then you have to commute farther, longer distances. But that's a really great question. You know, and they did have some money for replacement housing, but I'm not sure all people were given adequate housing afterwards, so that was a big issue too.
They had access to public transit.
Yeah, so that's one of these. That's why I think transportation is really important, actually. But that's a great question too. I think it's improved, but a lot of them didn't actually. Yeah, so that's the farther they live away from downtown and the kind of core of the city, it can take really sometimes hours to get into the city for their work. That's a really great question. I think that's a lot of the problem that people were worried about. Yeah, over here.
How does urban renewal become more efficient?
Oh, well, I guess that's a good question too. So how does urban renewal become more inclusive or inclusive, right? I think probably participatory planning, so if you can include the community more in the planning process, I think that's really probably the solution. And that one community, Villa Autódromo, they actually had their own plan and everything, but the official planners pretty much disregarded it altogether. I think they should have incorporated that more. That would have been a really nice role model, to sort of incorporate community input into the planning process. How to do that? So I guess partly it's like they were dealing with this scale. They had like over 12,000 athletes to settle, to house during the Olympics, and they also wanted it done on a certain schedule. So I guess that was probably the pressure they were feeling. But that's a really good question too. But I think if the community participates and develops an alternative plan, there may be more serious consideration that you begin into incorporating those ideas into the final outcome. That's a good question. Yeah, thanks.
I was actually, in relation to that question, thinking about Harvey's idea of the spatial fix.
Right.
And how the Olympics serves as like this way to sustain growth or to just completely revamp the urban fabric in order to spur investment.
Mm-hmm.
I was also wondering how much, though, that people in kind of like participatory planning actually got their say in the Olympics, because from this presentation I get the feeling that in some levels, as much as the elites want to use this to invest, it also opens the space for people living in the favelas, for instance, to make certain demands from the government.
Right.
And it also, there were these widespread protests. Do you have any sort of like evaluation on how like, did people generally get some demands met, or was it very still much like a top-down process?
Yeah, boy, yeah. So you're right. I mean, that's the critique that a lot of people raise, is that all this investment is really to promote the growth machine, and a lot of real estate speculation as well to kind of promote gentrification and redevelopment of much of the city. Now, partly I think it will benefit the city in the long run, but it's contrasted with this notion of people using this as an opportunity to protest and make demands on the state to redistribute income or redistribute the benefits, right? I think that there were certain things, for example, some of the housing, there probably was less displacement than there would have been, because the projects actually had in mind much more displacement from around many of these projects. I think that the transportation probably emphasized more the bus rapid transit to try to get people more effectively around the city, especially during those events. I think that, personally, I feel that probably benefited the general population. Did it really challenge that whole ideal that the city is reshaped in terms of profitability? No. It didn't. So I'm sure David Harvey would be among those critics who would say, the Olympic was a model built upon the sort of corporate neoliberal idea of benefits to the elite rather than the mass of the population. So I think that's a major criticism you could still make. I guess the pragmatist in me still looks at the setting and says, what else could they do, in a way? Because they had to develop all these new facilities and make these improvements in a situation with a government that's in crisis, with a recessionary economy. So in a way, they had to kind of rely on corporate subsidy and kind of this Olympic model that's been in place. I mean, when I was there, for example, they had the store on Copacabana Beach where people bought T-shirts and so forth. So it was part of a whole model that I don't know how much of that they could have challenged, in terms of, that's part of the deal. When cities agree to sponsor a mega event like this, they sign on to the whole package, right? So they can kind of play with the proportions and adapt it. But it's still this idea of a huge event with massive infrastructure, millions of visitors. And so it's hard to radically change the context in which you're operating. I think that's an excellent question. I think it's probably two poles of understanding. It's more the one of the city as the global city, the commercial center to benefit kind of economic growth, and then the other one would be more the city as a home for residents. How can they benefit more from it? I think there were efforts in Rio, but they didn't live up to what the activists wanted, but I do think that they made some, I guess, lastly, in terms of housing and transportation, those were areas where I think probably activists did see some improvements. And also, I think the whole discourse. You know, they actually did change the debate about, and especially about the favelas. People started looking at them differently. So maybe that was an area too. But those are great questions to think about, I think, as we go to future Olympics. I do think this Olympic these Olympic Games in 2016 in Rio were probably the most openly debated of any we've had in recent decades. Actually, I think they were really debated and people got really into it. So that is actually really good, that people are sort of starting to think about what are the benefits going to be. So hopefully that'll be something that we carry into the future. So, okay, well listen, wonderful to see you here, and I guess what we have a reception now.
Yes, lots of food, so please, why don't we just there and continue our conversation.